Hello, good morning. My name is John Ignosh. I work with Virginia Tech in Biological Systems Engineering of Virginia Cooperative Extension. I'm based in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. It's a brief introduction to solar photovoltaic investment analysis and the System Advisor Model, SAM, decision support tool developed by NREL. We'll go ahead and get started here. We are recording this to later post as a YouTube video to share more information about these two educational resources. The participants' microphones are muted. We'd like to have you communicate just through the chat box if you can. We're interested in your questions, comments, but just because of background noise, issues like that, it's easier if we manage that through the chat box. So as questions come to mind throughout the presentations today, please use the chat box, which should be on the right side of your screen, or if you've maximized the window here, it'll be on the top pop-up menu there, a chat box icon for you to enter in any questions you might have. If you have any IT issues on your end, again, we're going to record this, and we can make sure that we get a copy of the recording to you later on. To best see the screens through the presentations and software demonstration, if you also use the menu options, usually on the far right of the menu options is a drop-down arrow that will let you maximize the panel on your end. So if we're sharing a PowerPoint slide or we're sharing a software demo, you can maximize that view on your end of what you're seeing through the toggles of the WebEx controls there. And it's where you would find the chat box and some of the other controls. You also see a drop-down arrow to maximize the screen on your end. Now, this is a real brief introductory webinar. We're not going to be able to go into any real depth on a lot of these topics, but we do want to introduce some of these resources, some of this information, and also give a heads up on a couple of educational workshops for opportunities for more in-depth training and hands-on experience with these resources, topics, and tools. And we'll have more on that here in a little bit. Our agenda, I have a few slides here for this introduction and overview, but the real content is going to come from Erich Romich and John Hay. They're going to provide a brief intro to the key aspects to consider in solar electric investment analysis, just some of the main issues, not really enough time to go into depth on any one of them, but again, some of the considerations when you're exploring solar photovoltaic project analysis. Erich Romich is from the Ohio State University, and John Hay is from the University of Nebraska. Then we'll hand it over to Paul Gilman. He's with the NREL System Advisory Model Development Team, the SAM team, and he'll give a description of the SAM decision support tool that can be useful in exploring different types of energy projects. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion through the chat box with our panelists. Now, again, my name is John Ignosh. I work with Virginia Tech and Extension. Areas I tend to work on in our on-farm energy efficiency, some renewable energy conversion technologies, different project assessment tools, and some nutrient management technologies. Through some of that work, earlier this year, came across a couple of resources that we'll talk about in today's webinar that I think would be of interest to some of our project stakeholders, some of our clientele, some of the organizations and groups that we interact with that are exploring solar photovoltaic project opportunities at a variety of shapes, scales, and applications, and particularly in on-farm solar energy. Now, over the years, we've developed educational workshops on different energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies and applications, including some project decision support tools, things that can help people understand how these energy conversion technologies work and that best identify applications where they are appropriate versus applications where they might not be appropriate given what the particular owner's objectives are for the project. And I think very much in that vein are these two resources that we'll talk about today. One is a solar electric investment analysis publication and the content from that publication. That's what John Hay and Erich Romich will describe. And then also this system advisor model from NREL. That's a decision support tool that Paul Gilman will describe. So I think these are useful resources that I know we'll benefit from in our work, and I think some other folks will too. So we wanted to have this webinar and a couple of workshops to introduce more people on best practices in using these types of tools and this analysis framework to explore these projects. A couple of workshops that are coming up after Thanksgiving. We have a couple of dairy energy efficiency workshops. If you're interested in that information, please just contact me and let me know. One will be up in the Shenandoah Valley. One will be up in Rocky Mount, Virginia. We have Scott Sanford from the University of Wisconsin, some other speakers coming down there to share best management practices for dairy farms. And then back to the solar PV workshop educational opportunity here. After this webinar, this short webinar, we'll actually have a 2-day session down in Danville, Virginia, down in Southside Virginia on December 13th and 14th. Day 1 will explore the investment analysis considerations in greater detail. And then Day 2 will be largely a hands-on workshop to learn more about how to use the system advisor model from NREL. Here's the registration, a snapshot or screenshot of the workshop registration page. Register for both days at $60 or register for a single day at $35. Again, the first day will be more on the PV project investment considerations, and then Day 2 will be focused on exploring these projects through the SAM decision support tool with Paul Gilman. And Eric and John Hay and Paul will also be there on Day 1, as will myself and then Laureate Tucker from USDA Rural Development to get some information on some of their programs related to energy efficiency, renewable energy for farms and rural small businesses. This is the workshop registration page again. Links to this, if you're interested, are in the chat box at the very top of the chat box. There's a link to register for the in-person workshop next month in December in Danville. And if you have any questions about it, please contact me. I'd be happy to get you more information. On the workshop webpage, registration page there, we also have links to Danville resources in terms of accommodations, restaurants, those kinds of things to plan your visit. And hopefully you can make both days. Now, in 2018, there's also a workshop series. This workshop series is led by Charles Gold from Michigan State University, titled Agricultural Solar Electric Investment Analysis Webinar. And it's a 6-part series held, I believe, weekly, starting mid-January, running through the end of February. And it basically goes over the solar PV investment analysis considerations. But this format is remote. So webinar-based, so you're able to access this content from other locations as well. So if you're interested in this information, Charles's contact information is there, and also in the chat box, one of the first links in the chat box is to the registration page for the webinar series, which again is in January, February of next year of 2018. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first 2 speakers here. Erich Romich with the Ohio State University. Erich is an Ohio State University Extension Field Specialist for Energy Education. As a statewide Extension Field Specialist, he works closely with faculty and staff from various program areas and departments to conduct research, develop extension programs, and teach in communities throughout the state. His educational programs are designed to guide informed decision-making on energy issues to enhance the overall environmental and economic conditions in Ohio communities. Also presenting is John Hay from the University of Nebraska. John is an extension educator in the Department of Biological Systems Engineering, University of Nebraska. He works in areas of the biofuels industry, ethanol co-product utilization, bioenergy crops, changes in farming practices due to the biofuels industry, small wind turbines, and small solar systems for home, farm, or business applications. He has a BS and an MS in agronomy, the BS from University of Nebraska and the MS from Texas A&M. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric and John. Give me 1 second, Eric, and I'll hand over the presenter controls to you. And a reminder to maximize the screen on your end. If you're not able to see the slides, adjust the settings on your end to make the slides as big as you can for each of the participants that have come into or dialed into the webinar today. And with that, Eric, you have the controls now. Thank you, Eric.
Great, thank you, John. And yeah, once again, the option button, the view, and then full screen for participants should allow you to see the slide deck in a full screen view. Okay, John, can you see my slides properly?
Yeah. We're good on my end. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So, yeah, once again, my name is Erich Romich with Ohio State University Extension, and I'm going to be kind of co-presenting these slides here with John Hay from the University of Nebraska, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. One of the things that's a challenge with the time that we have here today is summarizing this bulletin series. I think what John and I are going to try and do is really give you a summary of kind of what the bulletin series is about, how we approached developing the materials and the content that they cover, and then also we'll provide you some access as to where they are. But if you're interested in that kind of down in the weeds, detailed discussion on this information, that's where we really invite you to join us face to face down in Danville or virtually through the webinar series with Michigan State. So as we get started, I'd just like to spend a couple of slides on some energy trends in terms of what's happening kind of big picture to set the stage for, why are we even discussing, photovoltaic solar energy in agriculture. So this first slide is one that is kind of showing, through colored code here, the U.S. electric generation capacity additions by year. And you can see a couple of kind of trends that are popping out there. Of course, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but the coal additions here that we've seen. And then, of course, in the 70s, 80s, and 80s, we have the nuclear additions that are illustrated in red. More recently, if we kind of look here in the past 15 years, we've seen a big spike in natural gas additions, almost 228 gigawatts of natural gas capacity that's been added over the last 15 years. And speaking towards renewable energies, you can start to see highlighted in green the wind additions that we've had that really align fairly closely with the production tax credits, of course, but we've seen a lot of wind additions through the 2000s, and then really more recently, since 2008, I guess I would say, the additions of photovoltaic solar that we've seen here highlighted in yellow. And when you look at those trends, they continue to grow. And the one thing that I guess I'd point out is it seems like every year is a record year in terms of solar capacity additions. In 2016, the U.S. had 7.7 gigawatts of utility-scale solar capacity additions. And I point that out as saying utility-scale solar because in addition to that, and not illustrated in this chart, there's an additional 3.4 gigawatts of distributed solar additions. And so those are the types of projects that John and myself and a lot of other extension colleagues are dealing with when we work with farms across the U.S. And the types of systems where they're installed, owned, and designed to generate electricity to power a specific farm. So that's kind of a snapshot of what trends we're seeing related to PV solar. In case you didn't believe my numbers, I have a nice little box there to remind myself to mention them. So one of the reasons that we're seeing those capacity additions is related to cost. And this is an image or a chart from a 2017 report from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that's looking at PV solar cost benchmarks. And it's really staggering when you kind of think about where we've come in the last 5 to 10 years. To think back to 2010, we were at $5.36 per DC watt. That's installed cost per DC watt. So that covers your equipment, the installation costs, as well as soft costs, permitting, those types of things. And to see that in 2017 we're down to $1.85 per DC watt is really amazing. And a lot of that's been driven by the drop in the actual module cost. So as you look at 2010, we were right around $2.23 per DC watt associated with that cost associated with the panel. In 2017, the panel made up about 31 cents of the overall install cost. So significant reductions in the actual solar modules themselves. And I can say, based on the experiences we've seen here in Ohio, I worked with a farm last fall that installed a project at $1.86 per DC watt. So what I'm seeing in Ohio is very, very similar to what the national labs have been modeling.
And I feel like the residential scale and the small business scale is slightly higher than that $1.85, and actually maybe in the last couple of months it inched up just a little bit, but I don't see any trend that it's going to go back up to those high levels. I don't know if it's going to stay down this low, but it is amazing how low it's come.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. And one that I guess probably to expand on a little bit. So that project that I worked with here in Ohio, where we were at $1.86 a watt, that was kind of a statistical outlier, I guess you'd say. That there's one farm that I've seen that has hit that number, but it's ironic that it's 1 penny off of what the modeling is here. I would say a more representative sample of the types of numbers I've seen here in Ohio is, probably anywhere from 2 to 275 over the last year here has been pretty common. But once again, some of that's going to be driven by size as well. And so, the purpose of this slide is to really just show that, this stuff's happening. It's not just talk. It's not just farms that are interested in this. They're acting. And all across Ohio, I'm seeing, more and more farms that are installing these types of projects. One of the other things that I like to point out with this slide is that there's no stereotypical farm that you can say, hey, that's where it makes sense. I get that question a lot. Well, what type of farm do you see that it makes sense on? These types of projects, especially, within the ag sector, everyone seems to be unique. And whether or not this makes economic sense is going to be very dependent on site-specific characteristics that we work through the bulletin to really discuss. But I think the point is it's not one sector of ag that you can point to and say, well, it makes sense if you're in a dairy farm or if you're in row crop production and have a lot of grain handling operations. You can't necessarily point to a sector. You can't necessarily point to a specific area or region within the state. It's very dependent on local characteristics. Who's your utility provider? What do your net metering agreements look like? How much are you paying for electricity? What type of a rate tariff are you on? What does your load profile look like? So there's just a number of variables that influence whether or not this makes sense. But I think the encouraging thing is I've seen it applied on nearly every type of agricultural operation here in Ohio.
I think a good point with this slide here is that obviously there's diversity in what the systems look like and how they're installed, but what we also have is a diversity in the goals and motivations of these different individuals. And I think that's one thing that each person is going to need to explore on their own, is to say that what is my motivation for doing this, and really having a clear picture of that motivation. Because if we go through the economic analysis and come out with a payback, let's say, let's use just two examples, an 8-year payback versus a 14-year payback. A 14-year payback may not be good enough for someone with a very strong financial investment and motivation, while that may be perfectly acceptable and good for someone who has some motivation that says, I really want to be green, and I want part of my electricity come from green sources. So, motivation is a really critical picture, and one that we want to think about quite a bit. And so that there's diversity both in systems and what they look like, but also in how people think about and want these systems.
That's a great point, John. And while I would say most of the the farms I work with are more motivated by that financial piece. It's not everybody. Some are not. There's one that I can remember. We've recently ran the numbers, and based on a lot of the financial metrics, it was kind of pointing to this might not be the best return on your dollar for investment purposes. And that farm said, I can understand that and I recognize that, but I want to do it because I think it's the right thing to do. And he viewed himself as more of an early adopter versus a laggard. He said, I want to get out there and try this. And so, but he went into it eyes wide open, which is good. So, as a result of a lot of the trends that we're seeing, the reduction in the price of the project and the cost, there are some significant policy drivers out there as well, which we get into. There's a lot of farms that are considering this, and but with that said, there's a lot of moving parts to these projects, and they're fairly complex. And so I've seen here in Ohio, and I think I can speak for Johnny and John, related to Virginia and Nebraska as well. I've seen a lot of farmers that are looking for good information to help kind of guide their decision-making process on now analyzing these projects. Here in Ohio, we've had, since 2015, we've had just over 50 programs reaching more than 2,000 farmers on this topic. So it's a topic that there is a lot of interest in and a lot of requests for. What I can say is we've worked slowly over that time. So as we've seen this as an emerging issue, we didn't come out of the gates with a nice polished up 6-part bulletin series that can help address that. And so, over the years, we've kind of worked through this and used a lot of the experiences and lessons learned that we've come across working with farms to try and develop these resources. So, what we want to do is kind of highlight the Solar Electric Investment Analysis Bulletin Series. And I think the first thing to point out is this was a collaborative effort. And you'll see as you look at these materials, we've had a lot of support and input from various states and their specialists, including Nebraska and Wyoming and OSU and Michigan State and Purdue. I'm sure I'm leaving some others out, but there was a lot of input and support from various partners. And our real goal with this was to take our lessons learned based on our experiences working with farms and put together some resources that could support informed decisions. As Extension, I'm not here to sell you a solar project. I think John would echo that. We're not necessarily here to say this is what you should do. We're here to try and help you understand the process, the proposals, and really give you the information necessary to make an informed decision that you're comfortable with. Because as John mentioned, what is an acceptable payback is going to be very different from one person to the next. I think the last thing I guess I would point out with this bulletin series is I think we really wanted to kind of prepare you to use the system advisory model. We recognized the asset that tool was and the strength that is in that decision-making tool, but it's only going to be as good as the information you put in. And so I think our bulletin series really is to help you understand a proposal that you may receive and the various assumptions that are going into that and how that can help you work within the SAM model.
Through my process, and you can go on to the next slide as I talk about, but in my process of trying to work on this particular bulletin series as well as previous iterations that I did, I have some other publications that I put out before this one come out, and as I was working on that, I was talking to an installer and we were discussing what are some of the good ways to look at economics of solar, and one of the things we decided was that there's not necessarily one good number. The number that farmers and homeowners and others ask me about is what's the payback, and payback is a good number to look at, but it's not the only number that tells the story, right? There's multiple numbers that tell the story. There's the levelized cost of energy, the net present value, and others. And really, it's a mix of a couple of those together that really help tell the story of, is this right for me? And so that's kind of what this bulletin series is doing, is helping us understand what those numbers are, what they mean, and how to even begin to get good versions of those numbers.
That's great insight, John. So as we go through, we're just going to kind of share each of the bulletins or the fact sheets, depending on where you're at, what they refer to them as. But we started to kind of outline what this document looks like, and it started to get kind of lengthy. And so we really wanted to break it down into some of the key steps in the process, the financial evaluation process. And so we've kind of distilled this down into 6 logical steps or bulletins or chapters of a bulletin, however you want to look at it. And so we'll look at each one of those here. So the first is really estimating the system production. I think the important thing here is to recognize that there is a connection and an importance and the variables related to your system's production and that cash flow, because this is, once again, a long-term project analysis. So if you're looking at a 25-year project life cycle, production estimates are certainly going to influence your analysis on this type of a project. The second bulletin is looking at assessing the system cost, and we kind of struggled with this one. You would think that this should be somewhat simple, but it's not always as obvious as what you think. You'd be amazed at the number of proposals I've been working with farmers on, and I ask, I said, well, what are you actually writing a check for? And and they kind of chuckle a little bit and say, well, I'm not real sure. I think I'm writing it for this amount, but I guess I don't know if that's before or after the tax credit was applied. And so just really kind of understanding the system cost, looking at how you can break those proposals down into a manner where you can accurately kind of do an apples-to-apples comparisons on multiple proposals, and then looking at how do we include and incorporate the ongoing costs that they're going to be included with these projects as well.
These one of the things that was in the system cost you showed earlier was the BOS, or the balance of the system, which is really all the wiring and the grounding and some of those pieces, and those are really critical, not necessarily to get into the weeds of exactly what each individual piece costs, but to understand that there is those costs. The one that really throws a wrench into things here in Nebraska, and I'm sure other places, is how much does my electrician cost, and how much trenching are we going to have to do? If we have to trench 150 feet in one system versus maybe no trenching at all in another, there's some pretty serious changes in cost. And then when you're comparing apples to apples, that electrician rate isn't always captured perfectly. And so that's just an example of where we got to be careful and make sure we're comparing those systems equally.
So the third bulletin then, and this is, in my opinion, probably one of the most critical ones, is forecasting the value of electricity. And I guess I always kind of look at it to summarize this. I try and summarize it in 2 statements, because this is going to vary depending on your net metering agreement, depending on the utility provider that you're working with, the rate tariff that you're on. But essentially, if you own a PV solar system that's generating electricity to power your operations, not all kilowatt hours are created equal. They're not all going to be valued equally. And to summarize the way to maximize that, to maximize the value of a unit of energy that your system produces, you need to use it. And so the focus of this bulletin is to really understand, how does the net metering agreement work, what is net excess generation, and how are you compensated for it, to make sure that you're accurately quantifying a value to a unit of energy as you do your financial analysis.
this is so much harder than even when I begin to think of it, because as you start to compare this with irrigation systems and other things, it just gets really complex what those kilowatt hours are worth at an individual moment in time. And that's where modeling systems with things like the SAM model and other things get you a lot closer than some of the simple calculations, because those kilowatt hours are worth different things at different times of year and sometimes different times of day.
Yeah, and this is one that we definitely need a full hour to sit down and dive into the details of. But I think that we could all agree, John, just very simply put, we can't just assume that a back of the envelope calculation of, well, I spent X amount of dollars on electric last month, and divide that by the number of kilowatt hours you use, and just assume that that number is what you can value each unit of energy you generate. It's not that simple. And so, the focus of this bulletin series is to really highlight why it's not that simple, and then also, some best practices and lessons learned on how you can try and, more accurately assess what a value is for that unit of energy you're generating.
And each state has a different policy, and that's just such an important piece to that, is how they value excess generation. And every state does it so differently that that can really be the difference between some of the economic analysis and just the one simple example I'll give is just between Nebraska and Iowa. We could be 100 yards apart and have a payback difference of 2 to 3 years different, because of the policies in each state and how they deal with excess generation is different.
And I don't want to get into too much depth on excess generation here, but I do think it's worth noting. When you look at investing in solar, the one challenge is it is an upfront capital investment. You got to have a heavy cash outlay up front. And there's a number of tools that you're going to use to recover some of that investment. Right out of the gate, you're going to have your 30% investment tax credit. You're going to have depreciation, possibly the value of renewable energy credits or some other grants. But at the end of the day, when the dust settles and you've utilized those means of recovering some of your investment, whatever's left on the table, you have to recover with energy savings. And so it doesn't do you as a system owner, when it's your dollars that you're investing, to be very aggressive or overinflate the value of energy savings, because that is how you're going to recover the rest of that money you spent on buying that project. And accurately assessing the value of a unit of energy is going to help you with more accuracy estimate that. So moving on, the fourth bulletin, and this is one that was a little bit difficult to put together, because we wanted this bulletin series to have applications, across state lines that could be used by various extension departments. But it's just kind of in general to note that while the price is still dropping on PV solar projects, incentives still play a major role. The 30% investment tax credit is critical to this type of development. Net metering agreements, as John just mentioned, and how they can be very different from one area to another. A net metering agreement is an incentive, and it is a tool that helps encourage the development of these types of projects in some instances. But net metering agreements are very important. Other grant programs, such as the USDA REAP grant, is a substantial tool in moving a lot of these projects forward. So this bulletin series just tries to highlight the different types of incentives that are out there, the ones that we see commonly used with solar projects on farms, and then some resources as to where you can go to find information about what may be available in your area. So bulletin number 5 is focused on conducting a financial analysis. One of the things that we really recognized as we started to talk with farmers and look at different projects that were being considered and what some of the kind of the do's and don'ts and the good and bad and otherwise, one of the things we recognized was simple payback was often the metric that was often used when trying to evaluate these projects. And the simple payback provides, it's a useful tool in that it's somewhat simple to use, But at the same time, it's kind of difficult to assess these projects using just the simple payback calculation because of a lot of the factors we've discussed earlier, the variable rate structures, different net metering agreements, energy escalation rates. There's just a number of variable pricing components that go into these projects that make it difficult. And so, we really encourage utilizing more than one financial metric and looking at what are other ways that we can evaluate these projects, and personally we try to encourage utilizing net present value as one of those metrics as well, and a detailed discounted cash flow analysis. John, anything to add there?
No, I really just think that it's a combination of those different metrics that really lead you to understand and be able to make some of those decisions. And then I particularly like both payback and net present value are my two favorite, but at the same time, I also think that we got to do that payback in a way that is really makes that number fairly legitimate, and that can be a challenge because there's so many details that can be added. And so I do like doing it very simply as my first one, and then following in and adding some of the details. Some of the details would be the changes in cost of electricity over time, if you have additional insurance costs, and maybe some estimation of what maintenance costs might be. And I do say maintenance costs in solar tend to be low, but there is probably no such thing as zero, right? So we need to make some of those plans. So just some thoughts to consider. These publications can really lead you through this, but some of these topics are they have a lot of detail and complexity. Like any good issue, there's a lot of sides to it, and that's where coming to a meeting, either the one online or the one in person, can be a valuable way to get your questions answered. Try to we can help people actually run some of these scenarios at their individual locations at some of these meetings, and so that's going to be a good reason to come and attend some of those things live.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. And, in addition, because these are complex, and while the bulletins do a good job of trying to kind of give you that foundation level understanding, it is important to talk with others that are familiar with the projects, especially, when you're looking at the number. I mean, some of these projects are very expensive. I mean, they're big projects that we're seeing going on some farms. With that said, in addition to, to looking at extension as a resource, I would encourage anyone that's really looking at this to make sure that you're having this discussion with your accountant or your financial advisor, your tax advisor, whoever that person is, because there are a number of tax implications to these projects. So you'll get their feedback on this. In addition to your utility representative. I mean, they need to be viewed as a partner in this, and there's no one that can better help you understand your net metering agreement and net excess generation than the utility provider. So those are just another side note. I would encourage to talk with those two individuals if you're looking at this. One other thing I guess I'll throw out, because it's kind of a pet peeve, if you're going to utilize simple payback as kind of that initial cut on a project, and are you interested, the one thing I'm seeing sometimes here in Ohio that's a little bit of a challenge is kind of mixing a pre-tax and after-the-tax perspective on simple payback. And what I mean by that is the system cost is often shown kind of as an after-the-fact perspective. So they'll calculate simple payback after saying, well, the system cost is this, but we need to subtract our 30% tax credit, and we need to subtract the value of depreciation, and we need to subtract the 25% REAP grant. So the system cost is now a kind of a deflated version of what you're actually going to write a check for. But then it's divided by a energy savings that's on a pre-tax basis. And so just for what it's worth, if you are using simple payback, make sure that we're kind of comparing apples to apples in terms of, let's do everything on a pre-tax basis. And finally, the last bulletin is one that really looks at utilizing the system advisory model as a tool to help support informed decisions. So, we would encourage you to have multiple proposals, to compare them on somewhat of, on an apples-to-apples basis. And, when we really look at it, we kind of hope that the bulletin is going to help you better understand the inputs, assumptions, and variables that are necessary to make SAM work. So, the system advisory model is only going to be as useful as them. So, anything to add with that, John? I think that basically we've really designed the bulletin series to help you utilize the system advisory model. When you look at the things that are discussed throughout the bulletin, it's really trying to highlight the inputs, assumptions, and variables that you'll use as you're diving into that model.
The only thing I'll say to finish is that in the chat box we did put some links to these, and you can download either kind of what we might call the Wyoming, Ohio version or the Nebraska, Ohio version. The only difference between those two are the Nebraska version is going to give more Nebraska examples and talk about Nebraska policy, versus the Wyoming version is going to have kind of just Wyoming and Ohio examples and policy considerations. So they're very similar when it comes to the rest of it, and that's because we were able to cooperate and use some of that and publish it under different logos. So we didn't recreate the wheel, which was great because there was some cooperation in that. Eric and Milt Geiger originally wrote the major version of it, and then I was a reviewer on that version, and then took and edited my own version with the most Nebraska examples. So download either one of them, and that's a good place to start.
Thank you, and Eric, thank you very much for that overview, that presentation. And as John mentioned, we posted a couple of links to the different versions of the publication that they've worked on. The current links are to Nebraska and to Wyoming. The content they created through what they call a Creative Commons license. So based on the feedback that we get from people through this webinar and the upcoming workshops, if there's interest in developing a Virginia-based version of that, please let us know, because that's a fantastic resource that they've already put together that we can adapt with some content unique to some of the policies and opportunities in Virginia, but to kind of leverage that information. But meanwhile, the links are there to those publications, and I think they're fantastic resources. I'll take back the presentation controls real quick, John, while I introduce Paul here. And as a reminder, as Eric alluded to, there's a lot of content here to go over, and the details matter, and they're specific to each project. So if you are interested, we do have these two workshops coming up, this two-day workshop coming up later in Danville, Virginia, December 13th and 14th. Day one is going to focus largely on what Eric and John just covered through these fact sheets, but to go into much more depth into the details of how to do these types of analysis for these projects. And then day two will be focused on the System Advisor Model tool developed by NREL with Paul Gilman. And I'm going to introduce you, Paul, right now. He'll give a bit of an overview of what SAM's all about. Paul is a technical writer and trainer, and he's worked on projects for the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, and other clients since 2002. He's written documentation for NREL's System Advisor Model, the SAM model, PV Watts, and Homer, which are all kind of project exploration, decision support tools that can be useful for these types of projects. Paul designed and facilitated dozens of training workshops for energy professionals around the world, and has provided technical assistance to project developers in the preparation of feasibility studies for renewable energy projects. Paul has a BS in electrical engineering from the University of Washington and a BA in music performance from Oberlin College. With that, Paul, I'll hand the controls over to you for your presentation on SAM.
Great, thank you, John. So I'm going to try to give a real quick overview of SAM, and again, we'll have a whole day to kind of get some hands-on experience with SAM at the Danville workshop in December. I thought I'd start by showing you the software itself, just so you can get a sense of what it is. And so there, for photovoltaic systems, there's two different ways you can model them. There's kind of a simpler model that we call PV watts, and a more detailed model that we call detailed PV. And in both cases, you provide the model with information about the solar resource at your project site. So it could be a farm or location in a city. And then you provide information about the design of the system. So how big is the system? What kind of modules and inverters does it have? Information about any shading from trees or other nearby objects that might block sunlight from the array. Also shadows. If you've got modules arranged in rows, they can cause shadows on each other. So that kind of shading is handled by the model. And then, of course, if it snows, there's a period of time when the modules may be covered by snow when they can't produce electricity. So SAM covers all of those kinds of factors. And then on the financial side of things, we look at the various costs involved in installing the system, and also operating costs are accounted for. So these are costs that occur year to year as the project is operating. And then we have financial parameters here. So how is the project financed? We account for costs like insurance, various kinds of taxes that you may have to pay. And then for commercial projects, we also account for a depreciation benefit. And then incentives, there are various kinds of incentives that your project may qualify for. Those are all accounted for. And we have, as you can see, lots of different flavors of tax credits and cash payments that you might qualify for. And then, as Eric and John mentioned before, the value of the electricity is very important. And that's determined by, for these types of projects, the rate structure, the electricity rate. So what's the price of electricity that you're paying, and that is going to be offset by the electricity generated by the PV system. So we have inputs for a simple flat rate, if that's what you're paying, or more complicated electricity rates with time of use rates and tiered rates and demand charges can all be modeled. And there's actually an online database that SAM communicates with, so it can automatically download the rate structure for thousands of utilities around the country. And then the other component here that's important is how much electricity are you using? So what is the electric load that the PV system is going to be offsetting? And so you provide that data. So this is the hour-by-hour load consumption at the home or commercial facility over the entire year. So once you provide all of these inputs, you run a simulation and you get the results. And as John and Eric were emphasizing, and I also agree, it's important to consider many different metrics when you're evaluating the economic or financial viability of a project. And so SAM calculates things like the levelized cost of energy, which is a kind of a number that's comparable to the average electricity rate that you're paying at the farm. So you want that levelized cost of energy to be lower than the rate. You have the net present value, which is probably the most useful and informative metric. If it's positive, then your project makes financial sense. If it's negative, then it doesn't. And then our old friend, the payback period, which we all kind of struggle with because there's lots of different ways to calculate it, and it doesn't account for a lot of different aspects like the time value of money and expenses that shift over time and that kind of thing. But we do present one flavor of the pay, or two flavors of the payback period here, just because it's a familiar metric. And then you can dig into details. So we can look at how the system is operating on an hour-by-hour basis. So this orange line is the load, and this blue line is the production. So you can see the PV producing power. during the day when the sun is rising, or sun rises, noontime, then it sets, and then this is the load. We can look at detailed cash flow on the financial side. So that's kind of what SAM looks like, and a very quick look at what kind of how you use it. Next, I want to kind of show you some slides that kind of give you a little context for SAM. SAM is free software, and what it most fundamentally does is it calculates a system's hourly or sub-hourly energy output over a single year, and then based on that it can calculate a total annual electricity production number, and that number goes into a cash flow model along with the costs and other assumptions, so that it can calculate the cost of energy over many years of operation. SAM is developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is one of the national labs of the U.S. Department of Energy. SAM is a collaborative project, so the models that have gone into it have been developed by different institutions. And it was originally developed as an internal tool for the Department of Energy to do its internal planning and to decide how money was going to be distributed. And once the staff started using the model and saw how powerful it was, they decided it'd be great to make it available to the public. And so in about 2007, it was first released and has been maintained and upgraded annually since then. SAM's really used by a wide range of people. It can do a lot of different things. So this is kind of a quick taste of the kind of people who are using SAM. And it can be used for a lot of different things, from sort of looking at an individual project, evaluating its economic viability or just its technical viability, to doing kind of large-scale analysis projects where you look at the whole country on a county-by-county basis, and you want to generate net present value of a PV system in each county, where you change the design of the system in each county, for example, and then you create a map. So people are using SAM for lots of different kinds of things. This is kind of a diagram showing how the performance model and the financial model work together. So this makes SAM what we call a techno-economic analysis model. So you provide inputs to the performance model. It calculates the kilowatt hours produced by the system, and then there's inputs that you provide to the financial model. They get combined with those kilowatt hours from the performance model, and out comes a cash flow from which we can calculate metrics like net present value, levelized cost of energy, and so on. So SAM doesn't just do PV systems or photovoltaic systems. It can model parabolic troughs, power towers, solar water heating, wind power. So that's one of the things that makes it powerful for sort of high-level analysis, is you can compare, say, a PV system to a wind system and look at which one would work better for your application. And then it has several different financial models. It can model kind of distributed energy systems. So those are systems that are installed on the customer side of a utility meter, where you're using the power from the system to reduce an electricity bill, to offset electricity consumption. Or PPA projects, which are large power generation projects where you're building the system to sell all of the power to an off-taker through a power purchase agreement. And both types of models are cash flow models. So they calculate a cash flow based on the assumptions that you provide. So as we saw, SAM can predict the system's energy output. So this is just kind of a sample of the kind of results you can get from the model on the performance side. You can use SAM to optimize design parameters. So when you get to the point of, if you've decided that the system that is worth investigating PV at a particular site, then you might sort of dig a little further into some of the design details. And this is showing one such detail, which is the orientation of the array. So we typically think it should be pointed directly south. That's a rule of thumb to maximize the energy output of the system over the entire year. But it turns out that the climate at an individual location might affect that optimal array orientation. So in LA, because of the fog patterns, and in Boulder, because of afternoon thunderstorms, it actually makes sense to orient the array slightly away from due south. So you can use SAM for that kind of analysis, which is very hard to do with back-of-the-envelope calculations. And then we have a fairly detailed pro forma cash flow, so you can use SAM for cash flow analysis. And we have tools so you can export the cash flow to Excel to do additional manipulation of the numbers to calculate various metrics. And then just a quick mention here of you can extend SAM. SAM comes with a scripting language that's sort of analogous to VBA in Excel, so you can automate the simulations in SAM, and you can also run SAM from programs that you write outside of SAM in other programming languages. So if any of you are computer programmers, that this would be of interest. And finally, SAM is an open source project now, so that means that all of the code that we use to develop SAM, all the C++ code, and the supporting tools and documentation are available to the public on a GitHub repository. This means that you can dig in the code to see how the model works if you're interested. It also means that people from outside the lab can contribute to the model and help make it better, fix bugs, or if they want to contribute new models to add to SAM, that's now possible. So to find out more about SAM, go to the SAM website. Again, it's free software. You can download it. You do have to provide your email address to run the model, but there's no cost. And on the SAM website, you can find a lot more information about the model. And we've got support for the model. So there's a support forum. There's a lot of discussion about people's questions, about details of using the model. We have email that's monitored daily. The model comes with a SAM, a help system. So we try to provide as much resources as we can. And then the last thing I always end with, which I think Eric and John alluded to as well, is that with any computer model, any modeling exercise, the results that you get are only as good as the data that you provided. And as we say, garbage in, garbage out. So just something to keep in mind as you're using SAM. So that's what I had to say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for that overview of what SAM is and what it's able to do. It seems like it's a very powerful tool, and thank you for sharing that with us and our audience here. We have a few minutes here for any questions that the participants might have. Just please enter your questions in the chat box. I was keeping an eye on the chat box here. It looked like there was one, Paul, that might be kind of in your wheelhouse here. This tool, both perhaps the publications and SAM specifically, do you see them being of benefit to municipalities exploring different projects, maybe perhaps through a variety of different lenses, whether it's maybe on-site municipal-owned projects, or perhaps it's we've had issues in Virginia. I'll add a little bit to the question here from the attendee, but we've had questions from county planners and boards of supervisors and economic development people curious about what solar projects might look like in their counties there. So do you see SAM being a useful tool for folks from the municipalities exploring different solar projects and different energy projects?
Absolutely. In fact, I've been in contact with folks from different municipalities, local governments of various types, and the model is useful, for kind of planning purposes. If you're thinking of developing an incentive program, it's useful for evaluating proposals that might come in. Since it's a model, you can kind of do what-if analysis when you're considering different possibilities without having to make any investments. And the financial models are flexible enough to handle kind of although at first glance they're kind of for commercial systems, you can sort of set some of the assumptions to zero to handle projects from a municipality's perspective. So the short answer is yes.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Another question we received here is, we shared the links of the publications from the Creative Commons publications on the investment analysis, and the two links so far are from Nebraska and Wyoming. Eric and John, for folks that don't live in Nebraska or Wyoming, how should they approach that content? How much of it would be applicable maybe to projects in Virginia? We had a question from regarding Illinois, places that aren't referenced in the publications. And just also to kind of get everyone up to speed, I did include a link to the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency, the Desire database too. So that's a link on there also. But I'll hand the question over to you, Eric and John. Thoughts for folks that aren't in Nebraska and Wyoming, how the benefit they would receive from the content in those publications.
Eric, I'll take a stab if you can fill in. And I would say that 90% of that publication is universal across all states. Then you've got a couple examples that are going to be specific, but what makes them specific is mostly the policy difference. And that's where this database for state incentives, this link that you put up, they would need to look up their particular policy and apply how their policy impacts those calculations to the calculations. And in some ways they're going to be similar, and in some ways they're going to be very different. So that's a critical piece. But the reality is that 90% of that is going to be universal. And so reading through that, understanding it, and then trying to apply incentives for your local area to the calculation is at times the piece that makes it local. It can be a challenge depending, but that's what makes it unique to your location. Do you want to add anything on that, Eric?
No, I agree. We approached the bulletin series from the perspective of we wanted it to have applications across state lines, but at the same time we wanted it to be very detailed. And so that's, I think, part of the reason we structured it how we did. Like you said, 90% of that probably applies. Some stuff will be, once again, policy driven. So what are the details of your net metering agreements? Do you have property tax or sales tax in your state? Those types of minor details, you once again can get that information from the Desire page that they've provided in the chat box. So short answer is yes, it should be fairly applicable across state lines.
Great, thank you. And as other questions come to mind, please get them into the chat box here quickly. I'll post another link to our workshop registration page. Again, this is a 2-day workshop. We hope you can come for both days, but if you can only make one, feel free to register for one. But it's December 13th and 14th in Danville, Virginia. Day 1 on solar PV investment analysis, and Day 2 in-depth on system advisor model, the SAM tool with Paul. And it's 11:35. I'm checking the chat box. I don't see any more questions here. Some comments that people are excited about some of these resources. So thank you, Paul, Eric, and John. Thank you for sharing this information with our audience today through this webinar. Look forward to having you in Virginia in December. And thank you again for sharing all this content. Any last comments that either of you or any of you wish to share?
Thanks for letting us come on. Look forward to meeting anybody who comes to the meeting in Virginia. I think it's going to be a fun 2 days, and I think I'm going to learn some as well, especially on that second day with Paul. I've been playing with that SAM model for quite a while, and there's a few things that I'd like to get straightened out, so look forward to it.
Great. Thank you, John.
Yeah, and thanks thanks again, and look forward to seeing folks down in Danville.
Appreciate it, Paul. Thank you very much. With that, we'll go ahead and close out this webinar. Thank you all for making the time, and please let me know if you have any questions about the information that was shared today, looking for additional resources, or we can otherwise be of service. I'll end the chat with my email address. Feel free to reach out and let me know how I can be of any help. Thank you for making the time, and we'll email the recorded version once we have a process to the participants that registered also. Thank you, and have a good weekend.